Welcome back to On the Light. In this episode, I have a very meaningful and inspiring conversation with Garth McLean. Garth was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 1996. He shares with us how that unfortunate fate brought him to Iyengar Yoga. We hear about how the Iyengar Method helped him with his illness. We also hear Garth tell us about his first trip to Pune and his conversation with Guruji upon arrival. Throughout the years of traveling to RIMYI, Garth had many valuable lessons learned by Guruji, Geeta, and Prashant. In this episode, Garth shares some of those special nuggets with us. Please enjoy this episode of On the Light. Thanks for meeting with me today.
Of course.
Usually when I start an interview like this, I like to ask, what was your initial introduction to yoga, to Iyengar Yoga? And very, different initiation into the practice in that when you first heard about it, from what I've heard in some of your other interviews, you were in a hospital bed.
Yep. Yeah. Yes, I was. That's exactly what I first learned about Iyengar Yoga. I was lying in a hospital bed. So
maybe we should back up and get to that point first.
Sure. Yeah. Whatever you want to, however you want to go. We're good.
Yeah. Tell me about how, what was going on in your life. Where were you at? What ended you up in the hospital?
I had been working in Hollywood, Hollywood job, high stress, a lot of expectations, whatever. And I ended up, I started losing feeling in my body, basically. I thought it was a pinched nerve. I mean, I was going to the gym. I was doing a bunch of martial arts. I was also not taking care of myself very well. I was producing a play, I was smoking and, doing, whatever, the Hollywood drive, whatever, what I thought was, supposed to be maybe sort of healthy aside from the smoking side of things.
Right.
Going to the gym and just pushing myself and driving through, young guy, young enough. I get, early mid 30s and, motivated to keep going. And I thought it was a pinched nerve. I started losing feeling in my legs, actually in my right arm. Then I traveled to the left. I thought, okay, maybe it's a pinched nerve or something, doing martial arts, lifting the weights. And then it got into my legs. And then over the course of about a month or so, this unknown thing was kind of taking over my body. And I had basically gone numb from head to toe. I was having difficulty walking, having difficulty using my fingers. And I thought, okay, I'd seen a chiropractor, didn't really help. I just thought, well, let me, I'm not kind of sure. I was a little afraid of what's really going on, but I still had to, get the show done. I had to produce the show, so I was working on that, going to the gym. And then over the course, like I said, about a course of a month, it had essentially taken over my entire body. I'd gone numb, literally from head to toe. And so I finally broke down. It was very hot here in LA as it is now. And the heat wasn't very good for me. It made things worse.
Right.
And so I ended up going to the hospital. I called UCLA. They got me in immediately, which was kind of interesting. After my persuasive thing, like, this has been going on. I don't know what's going to happen to me if I don't see you soon. And so a doctor had seen me pretty immediately, and I was diagnosed with MS. Basically,
Wow.
what's going on. We thought it was a bunch of other things. So we did several MRIs, brain, spine, and got the diagnosis. It was May 23rd, to be exact, in 1996. I just happened to remember because it's one of those days that changes your life.
Right. Yeah.
And friends who were visiting me, so I asked my doctor, I was like, okay, look, I mean, he's giving me all this. When you get all this kind of life-changing calamitous event going on in your life, you're like, okay, so what do I do? I mean, I'm not ready to, I mean, I have this idea, like many people do. They have an idea of what a disability is or what it can be. And so I said, well, I'm not quite ready ready for that just yet. So what can I do? I mean, I'm an active guy. I'm still, I go to the gym, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. How can I, take care of myself? And having been through the martial arts, I think it had helped to have a different kind of perspective, maybe when you get a diagnosis like that. So he suggested yoga.
Yeah.
I think for my, body movements, kind of keep it cool, and swimming to keep the body cool. So those were the two things he suggested. A
Mhm.
couple of friends visiting me in the hospital. So then, as at this point, yoga wasn't as popular as it is today. And so friends who were visiting me in the hospital that night, they recommended Iyengar Yoga. So because of the Guruji's inventive use of props and skillful use of props, they didn't articulate it in that way, but they were saying, basically, you can use a prop. So I mean, Susan, I was having trouble walking. I couldn't use my hands,
Yeah.
properly. My balance was like way off the chart. And so okay, so
Iyengar yoga students themselves.
they were,
Mhm.
unfortunately, they are no longer practicing. They've
Mhm.
Iyengar yoga. They just have gone different ways in their lives,
Mhm.
and but I am forever grateful to them for introducing me to what Iyengar yoga is. Although they didn't necessarily go into in depth, it's just you can use the props. So if you can't do the pose, you can use the props to help you gain access to it, and
Mhm.
so then I got out of the hospital a couple of days later. It was Memorial Day weekend here in LA, and well, across America. And I'd gone to the studio. There was they had some special event on Monday, Memorial Day, and I was like, well, I don't want to go. I don't want to like go in for that. I'm like feeling a little bit self-conscious, but at the same time, I'm committed to doing something. So I literally stumbled into the studio the Tuesday after Memorial Day, the end of May, and very welcoming teacher at that
Mhm.
point. She's unfortunately since left her embodiment.
Mhm.
Um, and she was very encouraging and at the same time very realistic, very straightforward, as I think many Iyengar teachers are.
Mhm.
And certainly that comes certainly from Guruji, Geetaji,
Mhm.
Prashantji, and Dabi, of course, now. And she said there's no guarantee it's going to happen, but you're most welcome to be here and we'll do whatever we can.
Yeah.
So she got me going. That's how I started.
Uh-huh.
So that was my introduction. And from there, I was like, okay, I'm feeling slowly a little bit by a little bit. So I committed to going a few times a week, but I could feel a difference in my body. My body was getting better. I mean, yes, I had the intervention of having medication that was the protocol from the
Mhm.
neurology department, and I was responding well to it. So, for clarity, I was diagnosed with relapsing and remitting multiple sclerosis, which is what most people are diagnosed with in the early stages of the condition, which is generally between the ages of 20 and 40. Statistically, most people are that's when most people who have a diagnosis of MS are diagnosed, from my understanding, and the majority are diagnosed with relapsing and remitting. So then it can go into secondary progressive and primary progressive. Those are the various stages of it. Or you could have a one-off symptom or one-off event
Uh-huh.
where you're presenting symptoms, but it may not actually develop into a relapsing remitting. But anyway, so that's what I was diagnosed with.
Relapse and remitting, that is, you have the disease and sometimes it's presenting itself and that sometimes you're in
Yeah,
remission. Okay.
yeah. And so I was in a relapse. I didn't know what it was. So, I had symptoms, what I'd mentioned in terms of going numb from head to toe, not being able to control the body, not being able to control the walking. I've had
Mhm.
a whole range of symptoms, which I can certainly discuss if you're interested or mention them anyway.
Mhm.
And so the idea was to drive it into remission. And so that was the idea. So I was on a protocol of Solumedrol, which is a steroid, intravenous steroids, which helped. That
Mhm.
coupled with the yoga, not overheating the body was really important. And taking that on and having a very skilled Iyengar yoga teacher here in Los Angeles, who was welcoming to me and wasn't excluding me from coming because I was presenting, a struggling way.
Yeah.
And what was so beautiful was she encouraged me to come, and I mention this now because I teach, as I think you know, many people with MS, Parkinson's, and other neurological conditions. But she had me come to her level 2 class, even though I'd never done Iyengar yoga before,
Okay.
which I think was very astute on her part, in retrospect, and when I look back, because she could actually take care of me along with the other there were other ladies who are, as we know in Iyengar yoga, there's, many people maybe, or ladies maybe on their period, there may be other people with conditions. And so I was, wasn't funneled, but it was, or categorized or labeled in that way, but it was like a way for her to be able to keep an eye on me,
Yeah.
help out, and keep the class going at the same time.
Right. Because in the beginner class, so much attention has to be on each of those beginners.
Yeah, and everybody needs the teacher's attention in the beginner's class.
Right.
And not that I was like demanding her attention, but she was giving it in such a way to offer me a pathway that I could, find perhaps some benefit is kind of belittles the word, but to really start me on the path of yoga, and then encouraged, and she was strict and she was disciplined, of course, with me. It wasn't all restoratives. That wasn't the case, and she had the wherewithal to say, okay, this is what I can do. She could see that, when to push, when not to push. And of course, a lot of that, of course, I think also comes from the practitioner myself. I was like, look, I want to get better. I'll do whatever I can, but I don't want to put, I don't want to go back to where I was, back to the folly that got me into the condition in the first place, which I certainly see that happens many times. Like, okay, I've gotten something and I can't wait to get back to where I was. Okay, well, where I was maybe was not the healthiest place to start with. Anyway, so that's how I started. That was my introduction to Iyengar yoga.
Thank goodness you came upon a teacher who was able to help you, who, like you said, had the wherewithal of knew where to begin with you. And, I think about how lucky we all are in this method, because, you could have came to a level 1 teacher like me, and I at least would know, oh, I have to call my teacher, Kristen. I have to, you know what I mean? Like, I would know where to go from there. And so, yeah, I just always feel so grateful that this is the method I stumbled into as well, because just all of the knowledge that's there for us.
And Karin was her name, Karin O'Bannon.
Okay.
So she was a senior teacher here in Los Angeles, and that's who got me going, and that's how I started. And she was very encouraging. So as we say, as level 1 teachers, or maybe this is out of my skill set. I don't know how to work with somebody like that who's coming in. When I look at myself objectively, it's from a teacher's point of view. Okay. Yeah, I don't know how to work with that. So yes, call your, teachers or your whoever you can consult, whether it's local or whether it's abroad. I mean, we have such a wonderful, in the method, a global community, resources that we can call upon, and, to see how to helpfully guide. And then also it instills confidence as well in you as the teacher, or not just you, Susan, but, a beginning level teacher or a level 1 teacher. It's like, okay, I just want to teach yoga. I don't want to teach necessarily somebody who's got this like major, condition that I don't know anything about really, but it gives you that impetus to contact and then learn more, to keep learning. And that's, I think, a tenet of what Guruji certainly, and we can talk more about that in a moment, was always to go on learning. That was such a huge thing, to always be a learner.
Yes. And Prashantji is still saying that all the time,
Absolutely.
to experiment in your practice. And
I think Guruji was like so keen when I finally met him. I didn't, at that point, I didn't go to Pune for a few years until I got a little bit more stable in terms of my life. I was unemployed, I didn't
yeah,
have, a steady source of income. I've been diagnosed with a potentially crippling disease.
right. And
Um,
that's a big trip. I mean, that's no like
Exactly. And it prompted my interest certainly immediately. But I said to Karin, she said, you may want to get yourself to Pune if you can, and I can, maybe, see or, if we can help in that way, in some way, and get to the medical classes. And I said, why don't I just wait until I'm a little more stable? I mean, not just in my body, but in my mind, my whole, life
a
situation.
lot to process. I remember when my sister was diagnosed, it's a lot to process.
It really is. And, it's that fear of the unknown,
Mm-hmm.
which can be debilitating in and of itself. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's like when we don't know what the future is going to bring, it's like, oh, I
Mm-hmm.
think we all had a taste of that when the pandemic came.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what is the future going to be here? I mean, we can have our opinions, and they can vary certainly, but a lot of times I think globally, that's what I was kind of, getting a sense is like the entire world is going through a state of uncertainty, anxiety, potential fear of the unknown. And these were all things that when I was first diagnosed with this,
Mm-hmm.
unknown condition to me, what's going to happen? I don't know. So if I want to take myself into a further deeper state of unknown without having,
Right.
some sort of foundational structure underneath me. So what if something goes wrong? I'm on the other side of the world, and then suddenly I can't feel my body, or I end up and that's why I was a little hesitant to go to India immediately. But I
Mm-hmm.
did within a few years after that. And that's when I met
Okay.
Guruji and Geeta and Prashant, so many other wonderful people have had such a profound impact on my life.
Mm-hmm. So what year was that you went to Pune?
I first got to Pune in 2000.
Okay.
Yeah, it was in uh, the autumn in North Americans, North American seasonal seasons.
Okay.
November, I think, November, October, November, something like that. That's when I first met Guruji, and my life continued to only get better. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't within those first 5 years or so that I was first diagnosed that it wasn't as if it was all, rosy and everything's great. It was like I had several relapses, uh, from losing my eyesight at one point with optic neuritis, not being able to control, internal functions of the body like elimination, uh,
Mm-hmm.
digestion, of course, symptoms that have presented themselves, spasticity, invisible symptoms, which I probably still have, fatigue,
Mm-hmm.
uh, depression,
Yeah.
all that stuff. But the practice has always, you know, um, I've always felt better from the practice from day one,
Mm-hmm.
I would say, even though it didn't take everything away. I mean, how can I navigate this landscape of fear, anxiety, and I would have to say anger a little bit too, because it's like you're grieving. It's
Yeah.
like, why has this happened to me? I mean, wait a minute, I'm right in the middle
Yeah.
of of my career or trying to advance my career as an actor, as a producer here in Hollywood. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, and suddenly it's just like screeching halt. Um, and why? So it's only natural from the human response, in reflection, of course, now I can articulate it that I'm like, I was in a state of grief,
Yeah.
I would say. You're grieving a life that you thought you had, or you thought, or what you knew, and then when
Yeah.
that's taken away from you, it's like, okay, well, what do I do now?
Yeah.
All right. So I show up at the yoga studio,
Yeah.
and it was great. And even when my eyes were out, when I couldn't see, I was legally unable to drive, and all that from the optic neuritis. but it was a sanctuary to get into the yoga studio and be on the yoga mat, familiarity, and how do we adjust the practice accordingly to what's going on in any particular day.
Yeah. So let's talk about your time in Pune, and I'm curious to know how, I assume you attended the medical classes. Did you also attend the general classes?
Yeah. I mean, when I met Guruji, so I mean, we can start there.
Yeah, let's start there.
So when I got to Pune, I was like, okay, I got there, and at that point, Pandu was the administrator. If you remember Pandu,
Yes.
and so I got there. I registered for the classes, and Karn had recommended me as well as other teachers here in California. And so I spoke to Pandu, and I said, this is my situation, and I would very much welcome an opportunity to speak with Guruji. I didn't want to just assume that I could go out and speak to him. So he took me down to the library, and that's when I first met Guruji. So I
Wow.
told him, essentially some of, and perhaps more of what I just shared with you. This is what's been going on with me. And it's been over the course of the last several years that I've been able to pretty much keep my MS in remission. At that point, I was not doing, and I'm still not doing any ongoing immune modifying drugs.
That's amazing.
So I solely look to a yoga practice to manage my condition, my particular course of this condition at this point, and have for a while. Anyway, so when I was speaking with Guruji, so I tell him this, and at first he didn't want to speak to me about it, which I was a little bit okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. I've traveled across the world to see this gentleman whom I respect and that work, but he doesn't want to speak to me. So, and it was kind of initially at first, I don't want to talk to you about this. I'm almost, and I say this with all due respect, almost dismissive, of my query.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, let me just not just crumble, So I sat there and I pondered. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, it wasn't what you would have expected. I'm sure.
Yeah, it just wasn't, And so I was like, okay, so let me just wait and process this, because so I sat there. I didn't, run away and say okay. And so I looked at him, and was just in reflection, I suppose, and in my own reflection, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
Leave? Do I leave Pune? Do I go back to LA? I, and then, I think he was a little, can't say this for sure, but my feeling is that I think he was a bit taken by the fact that I didn't run away. And I was still
Oh,
there. I was still there waiting, kind of looking at him. And I thought, well, if he is this guru to me, then he'll decide what happens next. That's kind of what had gone through my mind. If he is the teacher for me, then, to someone to guide me, then he'll decide what happens next. And whether that's, okay, go, get out of here, or okay. And thankfully it was more of an okay. And then we chatted, he smiled, and we had a wonderful conversation. That was beautiful. And so he had me it was in the library. He had me do initially chair Bharavajasana. I was sitting in the chair across from him, so he had me do chair Bharavajasana. It's kind of a look at me. He could see what my body was capable. I was able to walk again, had control of my body. So he said, come to general classes.
okay.
Because I asked him, should I go to the medical classes, the remedial classes? He said, come to the general classes. I'll keep an eye on you. And go to Geetaji's classes, and we'll keep an eye, and we'll be in the practice hall. And so that's how I basically started, and I was very relieved and happy. And so I wasn't excluded. I wasn't labeled and put, okay, because you have this condition. And I see that a lot happening for many people, that you're categorized as, okay, you have a disability, or you can't do this, or you can't do that. All that said, with the caveat that, several things in that conversation that he mentioned to me that first day that I spoke with him, is that we every day, and I know it's not just for me, but he's mentioned to many students around the world, that we have to walk the line between courage and caution. So to be courageous enough to take the action, cautious to respect what's going on in the body, and to parse that out a little bit further, that to really underscore to really be honest with rigorous honesty, to arrive to yourself on any given day.
Yeah.
So every day can be different, but you have to be honest and be willing to share that, with your teachers, essentially, of what's going on, as opposed to being in denial of it. So those weren't his exact words, but that's what essentially he was saying. It's like to arrive to yourself, to be, and see where you are, take an assessment of yourself on any given day. Because some days can be worse. He can affect it. There are a lot of variables. So I started going to the general classes, and I responded quite well. And I didn't feel again excluded. I felt like I was embraced in the community. And then I since had gone to medical classes as both a patient, or when I say patient, I know that's not necessarily medical terms, but a remedial student. And in the practice hall, we did a lot of times there would be, recommendations of how to approach practice, what to take into consideration when the nerves are in a compromised situation. And of course, my own personal body wasn't the most flexible body at that point. But having to take it all into consideration, considering where the MS lesions are in my spine and on my brain. On that same day, he said to be patient, have exercise patience. He said, "You're willing to jump. You're very willing to jump." It's like, oh, that's my name. I mean, it's my nature, Guruji.
Yeah.
I want to get better. And I see that a lot in others too. It's like, I just want to get better. I want to do whatever I can to get better in my zeal to heal. And he said, be patient and, be a learner, and you keep coming here. Just keep coming,
Okay, good.
Meet the Geeta, take classes with Geeta, and Geeta, he called her Geeta. I'll keep an eye on you. And of course, then her classes were phenomenal, and being in the practice hall with him was phenomenal. And I also took Prashant's classes as well. So that's how I started at the Institute. And I fell in love with India, like many people do. And what I found with Geeta is just that compassion. To me, I felt just such a deep sense of compassion in her teaching, and in her exacting teaching of the asanas, which wasn't just the asanas, it was philosophy, it was all of it. It was the, compassion, the friendliness that we're familiar with maybe in Iyengar Yoga. And it was through that I think was aside from her demeanor, I really responded to her demeanor and her discipline and her respect for the discipline, and how in the discipline is where you can find that freedom, which ultimately, cultured a sense of the bhavana, a feeling for the asana, what is happening, without using all the Sanskrit names, but the bhavana, that feeling is when you get that sense of from the practice, you're leaving with a sense of in the practice, you're getting a sense of feeling, not just physical feeling, emotional, psychological, fully, a wide kaleidoscope of bhavana that can happen with our embodiment, our consciousness, which actually led to, a further depth of prajna, or awareness of how are we approaching, how are we modifying when we need to modify. And she had such an exacting and compassionate eye. And I was like, oh, how can I leave here? So when it came time to leave that first trip, and Guruji was saying, you can just keep coming back. You keep coming back here. Well, and study with Geeta, and it was great. And I went to her. I remember her very, holding back the tears, like, Geeta, I'm very sad to leave. I really don't want it to go. And, and in her very stoic way, but also with a little smile. She's like, yes, but we have to say goodbye to say hello again.
Oh, I love that.
And so I was like, okay, I can't wait to come back. So then we started going back, and I would go back every year, and it was great. So, and by Geeta really cultured, I think, and I don't know if it is necessarily gender related, but almost motherly quality, even though she did not have children of her own, but she really took care of everybody at the Institute.
Yeah.
And that mothering quality. And it just, to me, I felt so, I don't know, safe and protected
Mm-hmm.
under her eyes, in her watch, and also under Guruji's, Prashant, of course, as well. But I just felt very protected and safe,
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time challenged to break any fear that I had. And how can we break that fear? If we do it through asana, with reason, with diligence and discipline, and taking precautions that we need, hearkening back to, to have the courage and caution
Mm-hmm.
to courageously break through, and at the same time be cautious to respect what's going on in your body.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all those things that Guruji was mentioning about being a learner. Just continue to be a learner. Like, don't think you've just got it because you're feeling better now that this is what yoga is, or this is what the practice is. It's like a continual ongoing practice. And as he often mentioned, I think, and many people I'm sure have heard this before, is to trace yourself. I remember
Mm-hmm.
asanas in the practice. So and also in the asana classes, he would interject when Guruji was teaching. But
Yeah.
I recall, I mean, these are the words that would continue to resonate with me, is to really trace yourself in your practice.
Yeah.
What is happening? And as he often would say in the practice hall, Kaisala, it's like, what happened?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you do this, what happened? What happens when you do this? What happens when move in this way, or put our consciousness, our awareness into that pressure on this part of the foot, or how does it affect? Can you feel that? And to trace yourself and trace maybe the source of that bhavana. And that
Mm-hmm.
bhavana, of course, starts maybe with the physical body, even though we can't, at points I couldn't feel it. I still don't have complete feeling in my right leg, from the nerve damage that's been there over the years. But if I can position the body and allow the mind to trace what is the source of action, where is it going to, what is the feeling that it creates, not only physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and how can that perhaps catapult us or carry us out of that state of fear,
Yeah.
trepidation, uh,
Mm-hmm.
or empowerment. Because I remember having gone, and it was maybe about my third or fourth trip to Pune at one point, and I was starting to teach.
Okay.
And and I was starting to see people, because now I see a lot of people with MS, Parkinson's, post-stroke, ALS, motor neuron disease, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember saying to Guruji one day, I said, sir, when I see people who are struggling with multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's, and they're struggling with their bodies, my heart goes out to them. And he looked at me and he said, what good does that do? You have to
Mm-hmm.
put that in your touch.
Mm-hmm.
So the touch is not necessarily physical touch,
Yeah.
but how do you touch somebody? How can you, rather than letting this, be in your heart, it's like you have to put that in your touch as a
Yeah.
teacher. And how can you maybe encourage that student to also have a transformative experience?
Mm-hmm.
So these were things that Guruji, these are words that still resonate and inform a lot of my own personal practice, my teaching, and how can I, transform that, and that touch, even though we've been on for many the last several years now with the Zoom and the online classes, and we've gone away, but now we're getting back, thankfully, to more in person again. But that touch can still be there when you're 5,000 miles away, 3,000 miles away, is how can we communicate? How are we presenting? How are we presenting the subject so that that student on the other side is I can also have that same feeling of that internal touch of discovery and transformation that can happen when well, why don't we try doing the pose this way and see how that might feel for you, and what is it touching on from our memory when we've been in an in-person class. And I've worked with several people now over the course of the pandemic whom I've never met. They've never been to an in-person class ever.
Like my sister.
Like your sister. There's a lady who I will be meeting actually this fall I'm teaching in Paris in Europe. And she was diagnosed during the pandemic. She started coming to the classes. And so and she's by herself. So it's a bit of a challenge for me as a teacher, challenge for her as the student, challenge on top of a challenge, on top of a challenge. It's like, but how can we begin to culture that touch, that being able to see somebody, that being able to communicate in such a way that it's touching some part of their embodiment, whether that's physical, emotional, psychological, I keep saying, to help encourage the practice on transformation. So she's excited, like, okay, I'm a little scared to go. I've never been to an in-person class, and she lives in the remote part of France, and she's like, but I want to come. So she's coming, and she was very nervous. I said, it's okay. Here's a few things we can do. Don't worry. Don't, we'll always, be sure to make sure you're in a good situation, and we can always rest. We can always adapt. We can always, adjust accordingly.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is part of that. Put that in your touch. Physically, You also mentioned, you asked me about Prashantji and the impact of his teaching on my life, and has been, he just, I love the poetry, Prashant's poetry, and he's like a poetic philosopher.
Yeah.
And, recently it was Prashantji's birthday.
Yeah.
And I was sharing a memory with someone who'd asked recently, and I remember to this day, and I think Lee might have been there. This was back in the early 2000s, I guess, and but it struck me so profoundly. Which the question, the questions that he will present to you as a student in class was, what is your drive, motivation, execution, and purpose? So when you really parse that out, what is your drive? What is your motivation? What is your motion? What's your execution? And what's your ultimate purpose? We can look at that in our own personal practices. We can look at that on a broader scope of things. So when we look to, again, that's another one of those many profound things that Prashant has, shared. But that's one that stuck with me, and I remembered I have to remember this, and I wrote it down immediately after class.
Yeah.
I remember I saw Lee at the coffee shop. I was like, I'm writing away.
Lisa Berkerson.
Yeah, exactly. So I could remember it.
Yeah.
Sometimes, it's like, but it was so profound. It had such profound effect on my, when I approach a practice. Well, what is my drive? Why am I doing this today? What's my motive? And then and you can then translate that beyond your own practice into that of being a teacher. For me, Susan, I remember it was a different apartment than what I'm in now. I was sitting in Hollywood. Shortly after I was diagnosed. I'd been going to yoga for maybe about 2 or 3 months, and had gone through all the range of emotions from, okay, do I want to even continue? No, it's not to be all a big downer, but yeah, do I even want to continue in this embodiment? If I were to end it, I don't know what my future is going to be. So yes, those suicidal thoughts are there. I'm not, lying. But then, having had the teaching, which provided not a false sense of hope, but a realistic sense of hope, that okay, I'm not going to take my MS away. That's not going to, I can't do that. I'd like to think that this is a cure. It's not, but it's a way that I can navigate this, and I'm feeling actually really good, and I'm feeling quite happy. And so I thought, if there's one person, this is how I started to teach. I start to think about teaching. It's like, if there's, like at that point, it was still very early on. I hadn't even embarked on the teaching aspect of it. But if there's one other person in the world that I can maybe share this experience with and perhaps pull them out of that state of despair and hopelessness, and that this is a viable, accessible way to practice and a way to move beyond, and to really break through, then I think that's my drive to be
Yeah.
able to teach. That's my motive to be able to teach. And it's leaves me speechless sometimes how moved I can be as a teacher. Maybe I'm just a little bit softy in that way, but when I see someone having a transformation and in their experience through yoga, it's not through me, it's like through the teachings of Guruji and Geeta and Prashant and Abhi. It's like, how can we, you know, survive this with a reasonable sense of happiness, functionality, to be able to, it's not all doom and gloom. There are many things that we can discover, and I've seen that happen with others. And recently, I just have to share, I've been working with a student I've been seeing for a while here in Los Angeles, who is a textbook case of Parkinson's. He's been struggling with Parkinson's for over 15 years. And a few months ago, he had a stroke. So, which was a challenge. It's what happened. It was an ischemic stroke that he had. And what was so, I visited him in the hospital, and it wasn't anything that precipitated from our yoga practice. It wasn't like that. This is what happened. He had a stroke. He was like, I really want to get back to yoga as soon as I can. And so when I started working with him again, I said, well, I'm happy to come to your home, see if we can get you walking again, get you moving again. And so slowly, again, be patient, courage and caution. It's like the parampara of passing on Guruji's words. And when he, was first standing up, he could barely stand up. I mean, he would use his walker. And I saw him I saw him yesterday, but I also saw him last week when I saw him turn a corner. And he was like, I said, okay, you need your hand getting up? He's like, nope. He stood up, he stood in Tadasana. I mean, his Parkinson's is there, so he's got the tremor, but he stood in Tadasana. He stood on his own 2 feet. He was standing erect. And it was like, inside, I'm going, I'm like going, this is so great. I'm celebrating his win, but I didn't let him see, how emotionally moved I was by him embracing that. To me, it was resonating, it was reflective of all the teachings that had been passed on to me. Whatever I could, and again, I'm just a conduit. It's not me, but it's the yoga that has helped him to be able to get back on his feet. His Parkinson's hasn't gone away. Yes, he's dealt with the stroke. Yes, he's still learning how to walk properly and balance, but now he's not using the walker as much. He can navigate stairs again. He's able to walk around the house, able to sit down, get up, do some yoga poses. And so we're cautiously moving forward and courageously, patiently,
Yeah.
continuing to learn. So
It's very moving.
it's very moving. I can only imagine what Guruji has seen over the years, and Geeta and Prashant and Abhi. I'm sure a range of so many things, but when we see those who have overcome adversity and embraced, just a whole positive transformation in terms of the outlook on life, can be so much more rewarding.
Yeah.
So anyway,
It's like the power of the practice. It's extremely powerful, and to
it
feel,
is.
and I'm sure every person you touch is so grateful for that, just as though the same way that you're so grateful for, all of the love that you receive from Geeta ji and Guruji.
Yeah. It anyway, it is. It's I mean, I feel like, how do I pay it forward? I
Mhm.
have to pay this forward. This is not just for me to hold on to.
Mhm.
Guruji at his 85th birthday, he had a one. I don't know if you were there for it or not, but it was on a T-shirt. It was like they if I remember correctly, it was sharing does not impoverish,
Mm.
and withholding does not enrich. So if we are taking, okay, how can I get better? How is this serving me? How is it, making my life better? But if I'm
Mhm.
always taking it and I'm not sharing that with anybody else, or I'm withholding it from everybody else, you know,
Mhm.
by sharing it, it doesn't make me less of a person, or it doesn't, I'm not trying to hoard this, or in that sense of like,
Mhm.
okay, this is what I got from Guruji and I'm going to hold on to it.
Right.
This is what I got from Geeta, and I'm going to hold on to it. I'm never going to let it go. And there's merit in that too, of course. Not everybody is bound or needs or driven to be a teacher. But for me personally, I felt it changed my dharma,
Mhm.
you could say,
Yep.
in the trajectory of my life, of what I was looking for. I was going to, I was hoping to be an actor, and I still do some acting, of course. And but that was my number one drive initially.
Yeah.
The drive, motive, motion, execution, and purpose changed when I was introduced to yoga.
The universe had a different plan for you.
It did. It did. I don't know how the universe identifies, but
I don't know either.
yeah. But apparently, I guess so. And it's like, okay. And one thing I learned certainly from my past and as an actor is like, say yes.
Yeah.
Okay, say yes, as opposed to don't. And so what was wonderful was to be able to blend the two, to be honest. It was for Guruji's centenary celebrations were 2018. And so as an actor, I thought also, I still write, I still, share and storytelling and all that stuff. And so I wrote a one-person show about my journey with
Oh,
being diagnosed with all this and the profound effect of Iyengar Yoga on my life, and certainly dealing with MS. And then I'd taken the show to Edinburgh, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 2018. Um, you know, again, motive was to, yes, I want to perform this show. I want to share it with the world. And
yeah.
at the Edinburgh Festival, there's like a wide range. It's up in Scotland, happens annually, and in Scotland has one of the highest rates of MS in the world
Really?
per capita. Yeah. Why we don't know necessarily. There's theory on the lights, the vitamin D that can affect persons with MS. So
Oh.
this is a way to also bring this in a different platform, in a different format
Mhm.
in the theater, to do the show, about MS and yoga, and it drew a lot of people from across the UK and other places around the world, and certainly Scotland as well,
Mhm.
of how yoga can be integrated. And this is the work of B.K. Iyengar, and it's it's the 100th anniversary of his birth this year. So that was a reason for taking it to Edinburgh. And then we did it aside from our own expenses, then to raise money for the Blur project. And so that was another way of giving back. And it was a wonderful way to combine, the fabric of being an actor, a performer, a writer, or whatever that is, maybe, and at the same time doing yoga and hopefully, inspiring others to take up the practice if they are in that state of despair or hopelessness,
Mhm.
and how things can be adjusted. Anyway, so that happened, and that was great. That was fun.
Was that recorded, the performance?
I do have a recording of it somewhere, but I mean, I didn't record the Edinburgh production.
Mhm.
Recorded a production here, but it was very raw footage. So,
Mhm.
but I'm hoping to now. I've had to change it a little bit, just in terms of my own. I had to adjust my practice a little bit from things that I was doing in the show at that point.
Mhm.
Uh, but yeah, it's still the same motive is there. So I'm looking to rewrite it at one point, and then the pandemic happened, and it was like, okay, and then since the pandemic. Then I didn't go back to Edinburgh with that. But that's not to say it's on the shelf, but it's not collecting dust. We'll say it that way.
Okay,
So maybe something will come to be with that yet again.
good.
And but then I got caught up with writing this book.
Okay, the book.
Yeah, so I wrote a book. Speaking of the centenary celebrations,
Yes.
I'd done the show in Edinburgh in 2018.
Yeah.
Gone to Pune, whatever. And if you were there for the centenary celebrations, I'm sorry I didn't recognize you if you were there.
I wasn't there. I wasn't
Okay.
there.
A lot of people there from all over the place.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful. Geeta taught. And so I was leaving Pune shortly thereafter on the 16th of December. On the 15th of December, which happens to be my birthday, and I was going to, I would always, celebrate my birthday in Pune, which was always so much fun to do, and because I was often there in December, and so I stopped by the Institute because I knew I was leaving the next day, so I stopped by the Institute. I just had a little card for Geeta, and Harith was outside. If you know Harith, Abhi's brother. And he's like, oh, Geeta may have a minute if you want to speak to her. It's like, oh, I always love to see Geeta. If she has a minute and she can see me, it would be great. So we ended up having a nice chat. It was just like late afternoon on the 15th. I was going out for dinner. And at one point she said, Garth, we know you here. Certainly we know you well here. We know your practice and everything, but it would be really wonderful if you can maybe write something, either for the Rahasya, speak to Rajvi, because she was the publisher of the Yoga Rahasya. And, maybe we can write something for the Rahasya about your practice, maybe share some insights about your practice. I said, oh, Geeta, it would be my great pleasure. I mean, I'd put some guideline together earlier based on my practice, because I often get a lot of inquiries. So you can imagine I'm saying the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's like, which, I know, and I try to respond to everybody in a reasonable amount of time. That's why it was just helpful to have something. So then when Geeta mentioned this, I said, okay, I'd be more than honored to do that. It would be my great pleasure. And then we chatted a little bit further and said, okay, and I'll see you next year and maybe tomorrow. And so happy to see, everything. And so wonderful to be here for Guruji's celebrations and blah, blah, blah. And we were chatting and, had our goodbyes. And then the next day, as we know, Geeta left her body. She left her embodiment the morning of the 16th. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
I got to write this book.
Yeah.
It as a book. And I at that point, I'd actually met a publisher in London prior to, because I was teaching when I was over in the UK as well. So I'd met a publisher because I was there doing the Fringe Festival. And so I met a publisher. And so I contacted the publisher and we moved forward. And then the book was published. It took a little doing to write a book, but it's based on a lot of my practice, and it was inspired by that last conversation I had with Geeta about putting some pen to paper and try to write something. And it's a starting point. It's not the all end all pentultimate. Every possible scenario can be covered, but it's steeped in my practice based on the teachings that have been passed on to me from Guruji, Geeta, Prashant, Abhi, and my own, and informed by my own personal practice as well. And again, it's a place to start.
Yeah.
And so that's the way I could honor as best I could in terms of that. So it has more of a global reach rather than singular to only people in Iyengar Yoga. So I put that out there, and that was published in 2020. So, and that's how that came to be. That's how that came into being.
I was thinking about the timeline. So that book came out in 2020?
November 2020. So what happened was, okay, so I left Pune December 2018, Geeta passed. So 2019, then it's like, okay, then I put in the book, I'd met the publisher, but at that point, then you have to go through the process. Book proposal. So I put in a book proposal, what you have to do. And it's like it's a process because it's a big publisher in London. Hatchet it's Singing Dragon. They do a lot of yoga books, but Hatchet's the parent company. And so you go through that process. So that took a few months to get that going. So then I had approval. So basically by the, I guess, late spring, it was like, okay, yes, it was approved. This is what we go forward. You send up the, it's all the contracts, going through all that stuff. And then I was limited to so many amounts of words. And then the editor had an idea of, offering different sequences, various chapters, so it was kind of like combing through all that stuff, getting that all hashed out. And then I was limited, I think, to something crazy initially amount of pictures. But I said, if we're just doing words, I think we need more pictures than because pictures can, offer things. So, but there was limited, it was like 50 or 75 pictures. I can't remember exactly. So no, don't quote me on it. I don't remember what it was. But when I started taking pictures, I said, if we're going to do this and have sequences in the book, then you need more than this amount of pictures. So how about if we do, rather than, whatever you allot for a book itself, a picture that we do thumbnail pictures. That way I was able to get more pictures into the book itself and couple that. And I'd never written a book before. And every time you quote anybody, you have to cite it. If it's on the internet, if it's from a book you read, or even get permissions from things people have said. So it's like going through that whole process. So then the deadline for the first draft, and I was traveling and teaching as well. 2019, I was still traveling abroad. And I think the deadline was initially December 2019.
Okay.
Is there any way? So that gave me essentially 6 months. I had 6 months to write a book. This is not a long time to write a book.
No, it's not.
And I was like, okay. So I was traveling, I was trying to write, I was, drafting things. And when you write, you draft something, you scrap it, throw it out, whatever, and start or whatever. So I ended up getting the deadline pushed to February 1st of 2020. So with the publication date for November 2020. This was pre-pandemic still. So I submitted the first draft February 1st. 3 weeks later, we're in a global pandemic. I was like, okay, all right. So everything came to a screeching halt. I get the first draft back from the publisher with the caveat, you can't rewrite this now. If you want it to be published, it has to be what it is. You're not going to go back because, a lot of other variables came into play with the pandemic. So what I was able to do is put just as an afterword at the end of the book is like, since the it's the writing of this, we've now entered a global pandemic, and I don't know what the future is going to be with this, but something along those lines. So if we can basically look to the yoga practice. And so I had, to correct, you go back and forth for another month or so, and then it has to go to print, and then it gets published. So that it was released in November of 2020. And again, I always say it's a starting point. It's not the all end all, but it's based on my practice, based on what I knew. And again, it's now what's great about it, Susan, it's something as a resource. And I think that was a little bit of Geetaji's, maybe what she envisioned a little bit, something that I could point to. For teachers, for others with MS, they've seen what's happened, from the yoga, they've seen the transformation perhaps in my life. I've been through some of my, what I've been able to overcome through their teaching and the practice. And I owe it to them. And so it's just become another resource that we can point to. And and now when I get inquiries, because now I get inquiries a lot from teaching, online classes have dwindled in terms of size, but not a week goes by that I don't get an inquiry from somebody about something. So at least now I have a resource that I can say, okay, this may not be your specific situation, but if you look at the poses, here's a picture, as opposed to finding something on some other random thing on the web, on the internet. But it's like, this is something that it's with minimal props because I wanted something that people could do with minimal props without having the idea of a pandemic. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So, because a lot of people, since the pandemic, not everybody had props in their home. So, in
Mhm.
some ways, the basic props, blankets, bolster, strap, chair, maybe a wall, something to hold on to. That's basically what I use in the book for the most part. And that way, then it abbreviates the conversation in
Mhm.
terms of, and sort of fast tracks it into, well, this is something you can look to, and then we can have a further informed conversation from there. Look at that first, tell me
Mhm.
what you think, then we have a different conversation. So I'm not having to explain, spend an hour writing an email because I could spend hours on the computer, which I don't have
Right.
time. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, gratefully and sadly at the same, yes, I could spend hours speaking to people, but I just don't have that bandwidth.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
Hmm.
that's a little bit of what's been going on with me.
Mhm.
So,
That's a lot. I was trying to think of the timeline because I know I gave your book to my sister, and it must have been that same, like it must have been December right after it was.
it was released November 2020.
Yeah,
It might have been in 2021, I think.
maybe it
I
was.
think it was probably 2021 when I met Anne, because I'd
Okay.
started the online
Mm-hmm.
first, and I remember when she had reached out to me, and I'd been doing it for a while. So
Okay.
I don't know. And the book came
That's,
out. The book came
yeah.
out at the end of 2020. So we were still dealing with all the, what are
Yeah.
we doing? What's happening in the world? We thought this was going to be 3 weeks, and then we're going to get back at it. And here
Mhm.
we are, what, 4 years later. So finally getting back at it. But I think it was 2021 that I might have met Anne.
That sounds right. Yeah.
I
That
believe.
whole time
I
of the
don't.
pandemic, it's so hard to,
It
isn't it? Like it was
is.
a big warp in a way.
I mean, it's a blur because we were just, in our environments on our computer. So there was no, a lot of times when we're out in the world, we're documenting, oh, that was then, because I remember
Yeah.
I was visiting, or I was on vacation here, or I was teaching there, and so it is a time warp for sure.
Yeah. That was a lot. I was wondering, are your classes only for students with neurological?
My online classes right now are, I mean,
Uh,
I've taught level 3 classes, whatever we call
uh,
it. Yeah, because I
just
I
sort of general classes.
general classes and or advanced or specialty classes.
Mhm.
What's happened here in Los Angeles is a lot of the brick and mortar Iyengar studios have closed,
Yeah.
just due to financial. And so we are looking now, along with several folks, to get back to in-person classes for the Los Angeles Institute, which is where I first started.
Mhm.
Um, we currently don't have a physical environment, so it's all online what they're doing. And what I do, so I teach general classes, but I haven't now in the last few months. I would say maybe the last 6 months or so.
Okay.
Simply, I've kept the online classes going for those who are reasonably able-bodied online. So I get a range of people. The classes are small, maybe about 10 to 12 people now. At this
Mhm.
point, it varies depending on time of year, but
Mhm.
several people from across Europe, the UK, and lately several people from India coming to class. And those who may need physical assistance, they're of course welcome to bring somebody with them. It's happened here in Los Angeles that I'm working in person a lot more, which since we started back, I'd say a good year and a half that I've been
Mhm.
working in person with several people, several with Parkinson's, some with MS, and some with other challenges. So I see them in person so I can give them a hand and I work with them in the studio. And then I haven't restarted my general classes, and I think there's a glut of online, general classes that people can attend. It's like, okay, well, I don't know if I need to squeeze myself in there, and um, if that's necessary. But when and yes, it's okay, but also it's having the time to do.
Yeah,
Now,
that's
when
true.
I don't know if you know Los Angeles at all, but anytime I go anywhere, I have to allow an hour. I think once we have a more brick and mortar place again in LA,
Mhm.
I'll probably go back to teaching more general level or specialty workshops,
Uh-huh.
specific like on back bends or arm balances or,
Yeah.
whatever, like do a journey series, which I was
Mhm.
doing a lot of like because I've traveled a fair amount. My travel schedule is pretty robust for the coming year. So then when I'm in Los Angeles to do a month, 6 weeks at a time.
I'm curious also, this is kind of off track a little bit, but how did you go about becoming certified? Or is that something you're
Okay. So I was like, all right, so what's the deal? So I went through a teacher training program
okay.
in Los Angeles, and then I went for my certification after
Mhm.
a year after that. I started the teacher training program. What I was saying earlier about being in my room in Hollywood or my apartment in Hollywood. And the Institute at that point was offering a teacher training program, which I think was a great program.
Mhm.
Uh, and so was accepted, and I mentioned my interest about being able to help others.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, well, if you do, then there's a level of hierarchy,
Yeah.
in terms of teaching anybody with therapeutics. But first, learn how to become a teacher. What is Prashant's one of his profound things that he said? Learn, learn to teach to learn, and teach to teach. So
Mm.
another one of those wonderful little things. And it's like, okay, so first I'm learning to learn, then I'm learning to teach. So once I got my certification, or once I went through the teacher training program, then at that point, I stood for my level 1 and I passed it.
Mhm.
And, I was able-bodied. I wasn't, symptomatic. I was able to do it. You know what I mean? I wasn't dealing with any kind of like major physical or I wouldn't say when I was still dealing with it, but I wasn't in an exacerbation.
Mhm.
Went through the certification process. It was stressful, but my practice got me through. So I went for the first one. And then at that point, there were 2 levels for level 1.
Yes.
Right?
Into one and
So,
under
and
two.
then the goal was to get to junior 2. So it's like, okay, so then, all right, turn the page, keep practicing. And then I went for I don't remember the timelines now, what they
Yeah.
were exactly, but then I went for my level 2. It was like, okay, keep practicing. But if you want to teach others with MS, because then I was starting to get people inquiring.
Yeah.
So I was teaching general classes at local studios, but then people were inquiring. I said, well, I'm not necessarily qualified. I can share some of my experience, but I can't officially under this banner, say this is, but I can share my experience with you a little bit.
Mhm.
And so then I stood for my junior 1 and got through and did my junior 2, whatever the timelines were. So I just kept going rather than
Yeah.
waiting 6 years between each certification process. And I got my junior 2. And then, yes, that was probably in about 2009,
Okay.
I would say, because I remember that because I was invited by the France Iyengar Yoga Association to teach at their convention,
Oh,
to
wow.
offer my insight for people with MS.
Mhm.
At that point, I was junior 2.
Okay.
So I was very grateful. I said, thank you so much. I'm very appreciative. I'm going to check with Guruji.
Mhm.
I wrote Guruji, and I mentioned to him, so sir, blah 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 blah, and I've been invited to share my experience with the France Association and the Teachers Convention, and his response was, yes, please do and share your knowledge as best you can, and of course you're working, continue to work with the senior teachers, you know,
Mhm.
there at that, and also in LA as well, but I wanted to have his. I didn't want to bother him, but I wanted to have his um, approval
Yeah.
before I go and teach for an association in a foreign country. When I was because at that point, in order to teach therapeutics, you had to be junior 2.
Mhm.
Then it changed. After
Yeah.
that, you had to be senior 1. that they teach therapeutics. So I was like,
Moving the care.
okay, back to the assessment manual,
Right.
you know, and then he graciously, because I suppose he knew my practice and he knew what I was doing, he graciously gave me my junior 3.
Hmm.
I was actually had applied for it. I was getting to study ready for the test. I was
Mhm.
going through the practice, and then word came from Pune that Guruji has granted you your junior 3
Wow.
with the caveat to stand for your senior 1 as soon as possible and get through.
Wow.
That was from Guruji. I was like, okay, all right, okay, all right. So then I started working on my senior 1.
Garth,
Uh,
that's a lot. I
I
mean, I
was,
think of the stress of
you know, but it was like, but if I go back to my motion, execution, and purpose,
Mhm.
kind of that again, that undercurrent of Prashant's teaching, which I also want to touch on one other thing that he said, which I
Yeah.
think is vital. And it's like, okay, my drive and Guruji is saying, okay, stand for your senior 1 and get through. So it's
Mhm.
like, okay, so I had to do that. So I accepted my senior 1, then I took my senior 2, and then Geeta G. I'm not from my inquiry. There were other recommendations from other teachers. They were saying me starting to teach abroad more and more. And so she gave me my senior 3. And that
Mm.
was in 2015, I believe that was. So that's
Mm.
how I had the senior 3. So I mean, I've practiced all those, and I have to say, having and it's certainly now in the background of the assessment process that the
Mhm.
previous assessment levels of certification were such a skillfully and wonderfully put together step-by-step
Mhm.
pragmatic way of approaching and developing as a practitioner, as a teacher, that
Mhm.
Guruji put together. The new assessment format is also wonderful.
Mhm.
But if we look at the background of what informed that, the previous assessment, of having gone from intro through senior 3, in and of itself was an amazing training
Yeah.
program. I mean, phenomenal. I mean,
Mhm.
if you really break it down that way. Now it can be sometimes some mentees are a little overwhelmed. It's like, oh wait, I've got to do Titi-Basana.
Right.
Oh, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? To get my certification, it's like, okay, you don't have to, I mean, yes, how are we doing? What's your approach to it? So it's like
Mhm.
mentoring that in that way. So it's a shifting, it's the same assessment approach, but in a different manner, a different playbook, if you will, a different workbook
Mhm.
that you're looking through it, or that's the way I perceive it as a teacher, a practitioner, a student of the subject. It's just a different process. I deeply appreciated and still appreciate the initial when I'd gone through my certifications through my senior 3 of going through it in that more pragmatic way, and
Mhm.
having support, of course, and the eyes and guidance from Guruji, Geetaji, Prashantji along the way.
Mhm.
Because you asked me something else about Prashant, and before I forget, I wanted to mention
Yes.
what he mentioned years ago. And when I was first going to Pune, and I wasn't quite, because like I mentioned, I have invisible symptoms, probably, maybe a very skillfully trained eye, like Geeta G certainly had, and Guruji and Prashant. Maybe not be able to notice that I have present some symptoms in this way. But I remember him teaching. We ended up having a conversation because I had an inquiry about something he was teaching. I said, I'm not quite sure if I'm getting it, sir, because
Mhm.
we was talking about Mulabandha Kriya,
Mhm.
is what he was talking about. And we were looking at things in standing poses and in a general class. And I said, I've lost feeling in my pelvic area. I haven't been able to control my bowels sometimes. I haven't been able to control organs of elimination. It's coming back, but I don't have complete feeling in this leg. So I'm not quite sure if I'm getting the nuance,
Uh-huh.
what Mulabandha, I mean, I can read it in the book, but I don't know if I'm experientially getting this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he said, okay, meet me at the trestle. So we're the trestle, and he put all these different configurations of belts around my legs and the pelvis and the sacral area, and gave me a few adjustments, had me do, a couple of poses. Ultimately it was Parvrita Uttita Hastapadangusthasana with support on the trestle, and he was giving me adjustments and pushing my legs and pulling and giving me adjustment with the foot, and so I can start to get a sense. And I said, okay, I'm getting a sense of this, but I don't mean to be, disrespectful in any way, but I still don't know if I'm catching it. And he says, okay, so meet me down in the office tomorrow. So we had a wonderful conversation. And in that conversation, one of the things that, again, I think is so vital of Prashant's teaching, and I see it reflected. I mean, he's been teaching it for years and years, but in his current teaching, of course, is to not get stuck. If we're always practicing the ABCs, turn your right leg out, turn your left foot in, or turn your left foot in, turn your right leg out, extend the arms, whatever. You're teaching that very pragmatic way, which is very good for beginners. If you're always stuck in first gear, if you're a vehicle, your vehicle will burn out. So it's time to progress, shift into second gear, start to look a little bit deeper. So he used the metaphor of a vehicle, which is a wonderful, when we have the vehicle of our embodiment, we're always stuck. If we're stuck in those rudimentary, repetition, of course, is great when we start. That's how we learn. But at the same time, not to get stuck there. Because he said, I've seen many, he mentioned that he's seen people who get stuck, you know what I mean? And they're stuck in that practice, that, what do you call, action-minded, only action-oriented, but how are we finding the more nuanced, subtle qualities? And if we're always only learning the ABCs, when will you ever write a story or learn how to sing a song? So how do we develop from the fundamentals and then take it further into a more, and I'm not trying to quote him, but in terms of the pathway of yoga itself, of yoga, as opposed to yoga, double A, double A, double A, double A.
That's what he says.
But to really the subject, to explore the potential transformation of the subject of yoga itself, what that is, and I see that certainly. I continue to take his pranayama classes, which are so
I do too. They're probably way above what I should be taking, but I'm taking them.
They're so profoundly, deeply transformational in so many ways, and using the imagination, and how can we work with the embodiment once we have those foundations in place. When you get stuck, and you'll get stuck in that first gear, how do we move to second gear, third gear, maybe not overdrive, but but to keep the vehicle moving and well tuned and well oiled, and doing our maintenance and our polishing. Guruji, always polish. Why polish your old self? Or that's another thing that just popped into my mind. Why polish your old self? Polish your new self.
It's been really wonderful and very inspirational as well.
I mean, I'm grateful for you, for what you're doing, to reach out and share the experiences of other senior teachers across the United States. And I'm grateful to bear the moniker of a senior teacher. And it was through the hard work and love and the devotion and the bhakti, and to be able to ultimately help others in some way, whatever we can do.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. And thanks so much for having me and taking the time out of your day to spend this time with me.
I hope you all listening enjoyed that episode as much as I did. Today, I've decided to read another passage from Light on the Yoga Sutras by VKS Iyengar. This is 228. Yogan gan ashadikshaye jnanadipti aviveka gyate. By dedicated practice of the various aspects of yoga, impurities are destroyed, the crown of wisdom radiates in glory. Patanjali sums up the effects of yoga in this one sutra. He says that by regular and devoted practice, the impurities of the sadhaka's body and mind are consumed, the causes of afflictions removed, and the crown of wisdom is acquired. This wisdom and achievement keep the sadhaka innocent and free of pride. Here, instead of the usual word abhyasa, repeated practice, anusthana is used. It is a dignified and noble word with a spiritual import, implying practice with dedication or religious fervor. The former brings stability, the latter develops maturity of intelligence. Yoga can cure or lessen our physical, mental, moral, and spiritual sufferings. Perfection and success are certain only if one practices with love and wholehearted dedication. Thank you for listening. Namaskar.